Our next presenter is Chitra Ramalingam, who is lecturer in history of science and medicine, as well as history. Professor Ramalingam is a historian of science and a historian of photography. Her research, teaching, and curatorial work range broadly across topics in science and visual and material culture, with a particular focus on the visual culture of physics in the 19th and 20th centuries, on 19th century ways of seeing, especially optical illusions, optical toys, and the prehistory of cinema, the early history of photography, changing discourses about photography as art or science, and decolonial museum practice. Her first book, To See a Spark, Experiment and Visual Experience in Victorian Science, uses the history of a single scientific object, the electric spark, to track how physicists manage their visual experience in the laboratory. She has co-edited a volume of essays by art historians and historians of science on the photographic pioneer and Victorian gentleman of science, William Henry Fox Talbot, titled William Henry Fox Talbot, Beyond Photography, and co-curated an exhibition on Talbot in 2010 at the Wren Library at the University of Cambridge. She's curated exhibitions on early photography, on antiquarianism and architectural photography, and on social portraiture in post-1945 British photography. Ongoing projects include a book project on the laboratory as image archive in the modern physical sciences, a material history of Talbot's photographic publication, The Pencil of Nature, in collaboration with conservation scientists at Yale's Institution for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage, Fixing and Fading, Photographic Histories, an exhibition and book on the science and aesthetics of fading in 19th century and contemporary photography, and Out of Place, a series of experimental installations involving re-situating objects from Yale's natural history collections, about which we'll hear more. Welcome, Professor Ramalingam.
Hi, everybody. Hold on, let me just get situated here. Thank you so much to the organizers of this event for giving us all the opportunity to think broadly and humanistically together across Yale collections and resources. And I'm especially glad to be following Ned Cook, who's I've had some of the most kind of humbling and illuminating experiences that I've had at Yale have been in the teach-ins that he described organizing earlier. So I want to talk to you all today about some work that emerged out of my own interdisciplinary practice as a curator and an academic working between history of science, history of art, and museum studies. A few years ago, I started a project which I called Out of Place, which is a kind of ongoing research engagement with Yale's varied collections. And in this project, I'm working with a number of various wonderful collaborators, both on and off campus, to bring seemingly unconnected, unrelated objects from the university's museums of science, art, and culture into conversation with one another. And this project will result in a series of online publications and displays over the next 2 or 3 years. There's one planned for the Yale University Art Gallery, one at hopefully the Peabody Museum when they reopen in 2024, and also at the Tark Gallery in Mumbai, and hopefully other venues as well. So today I want to explain to you all the process and the practice behind the first outcome of this project, which I've called A British Mineralogy, in which I collaborated with an Indian artist based in Delhi named Garima Gupta. This project explores the histories and layered geographies and visual landscapes of minerals at Yale's Peabody Museum of Natural History. So in a natural history display, like this classic teaching display of minerals that you can see on the left from Yale's Peabody Museum, natural objects, like minerals, from across the globe are typically identified with a specific locality of origin, so the one place which it is known to have occurred in nature. All other places through which that object may have passed en route to the museum, on its passage through human culture and history, are not usually relevant. In the collections of the Yale Center for British Art, which you can see on the right, and where I worked as photography curator until a few months ago, there are objects made in places around the British Isles, but also all around the world, made by people of many backgrounds, become notionally British by virtue of being there. Geopolitical relations for certain periods of time bound those people and places to Britain, to its state, its fortunes, and its aesthetic styles, sometimes creating rich hybrid styles like the so-called company school of Indian painting masters, such as Sheikh Zain al-Din. Natural history museums, of course, are understood to tell us powerful stories about nature, while we go to art museums to hear and see powerful stories about culture and identity. Now, this project arose from a number of generative dissonances, I guess I would say, that I experienced during my 4 years as a curator at the Yale Center for British Art. So on the one hand, disciplinary dissonance as a cultural historian of science employed in an art museum. But then on a more personal level, also as a diasporic Indian American at an institution whose unstable vision of British art depended so much on exoticized images of people and places of the global South. So as I kind of was conducting my work there on the photography collection, which is not related to what I'm showing you today, I kept thinking about what other histories were entangled with the history of British art within the walls of that institution, but were unavailable via the museum's fine art collections, its disciplinary methods, and its conventions of display. Gradually, I came to hone in on the Peabody's mineralogy collection, and it'll become clear why I turned there in a moment. I selected a group of 10 mineral specimens in conversation with the collection manager at Peabody, the collection manager for minerals and meteoritics. These 10 objects, or it's actually technically, I think, 13 objects, but as you can see, some of them are grouped by mineral type. They were originally gathered from locations in the British Isles, but also in southern Africa, eastern Australia, Sri Lanka, and western India. They were collected at the Peabody from around the mid-19th century through the early 21st centuries, each of them passing first through British networks of power, knowledge, value, and exchange. At its height, as you probably know, at the start of the 20th century, the British Empire famously encompassed the entire Earth, not only with respect to territories under direct colonial control, but also wider business and trade interests. This is a map of the British-controlled global telegraphy network around, I think, 1901. Yeah. But British imperial ambitions did not simply aim to cover the Earth's surface. They also sought to reach deep below the Earth's surface. Mining and engineering in Britain and its former empire are associated with global histories of migration, inequality, and exploitation, with the transformation of terrain and with ecological disasters past, present, and future. So these 10 objects, which I called migrant minerals, they contained valuable materials, from the prosaic to the precious: graphite, tin, copper, diamond, and more. And they were brought forth from the earth through the skilled labor of people whose lives became entangled with them and with the technological landscapes of extraction around them. And these are images of the Kimberley mines in South Africa, one of the most notorious diamond mines in the region. Some of these images are from Yale collections, like this stereo pair, and the others are not. Once unearthed, these objects embarked on voyages across the globe, participating in the global flows of people and commodities that underlay British power in a period of high empire. And finally, they were assimilated into a natural history collection, where they shed some of these pasts in order to become emblems of nature, apparently outside culture and outside history. They had become mineralogical specimens. So in this project, I was asking what kind of mineralogy might embrace and acknowledge these stories of excavation, translocation, transformation, and arrival, rather than effacing them in the name of nature. And I ended up calling this project a British mineralogy. And in this, I was inspired, or more precisely, I was provoked by the London artist and naturalist James Sowerby. In the early 19th century, Sowerby published a multi-volume treatise which he called British Mineralogy. So no article, just British Mineralogy. This was the first major illustrated mineralogical publication in Europe. Issued in installments between 1804 and 1817, Sowerby's work was visually groundbreaking, with 550 hand-colored engravings based on individual mineral specimens. There were two sets of books. So the first volumes, British Mineralogy, were followed a few years later by their counterpart, which was a large single volume called Exotic Mineralogy. But Sowerby regularly undermined his own proposed distinction between the British in this first set of volumes and the exotic in the final set. In his text, the words British, English, native, foreign, and exotic carried a lot of weight, and there were suggestive slippages and ambiguities throughout. Both the British and the exotic mineralogy project for Sowerby were limited to reproducing specimens that were held in London-based mineral collections, which themselves depended, of course, upon networks of British travelers to distant lands. And in his project, even a meteorite, so a piece of stone that was theorized to have fallen from the heavens, so an object that's literally from outer space, was found to be British. It was included as part of British mineralogy. In the 5th volume, Sowerby observed, "What has been thought remarkable is that this work on British mineralogy should include so many subjects previously considered as foreign." So I was looking through Sowerby's drawings and his text while I researched these 10 mineral specimens, and I began to wonder what it would look like to propose a different kind of British mineralogy. Sowerby's work was an exercise in drawing the boundaries of locale and belonging and Britishness, in a quite different way than either the Peabody Museum or the Yale Center for British Art did, or for that matter, quite different from how a present-day UK immigration officer would draw those boundaries. His drawings did not depict the landscapes from which those specimens were extracted, or the people involved in doing so, although his text did occasionally describe both the people or the landscapes. And so it was at this point that I realized that my project could not simply be what it had been originally conceived as, which was it was going to be an exhibition of minerals accompanied by a text that was grounded in my historical research into the objects. But the more time I spent with Sowerby, the more urgently I felt that this project required a visual practice as a part of it, a non-textual way of restoring a multi-layered sense of place and belonging to each object. And at this point in my research, I had begun to assemble a kind of visual archive for each mineral as I researched it. So I was finding historical photographs, diagrams, maps, printed texts, and other documents, many of which were in Yale collections, some of which were things I had accessed digitally elsewhere. And all the historical images that I'm showing you today are from this archive that I assembled. And I felt like something needed to be done with them as part of this project, something thoughtful that didn't just reproduce the visual conventions of the colonial gaze. And in any case, I was sometimes in this research coming across disturbing and graphic imagery of abuse and violence, including things that I found in Yale collections, again, images that I couldn't bring myself to even save in my database, let alone contemplate publishing. And this was when I came across the work of the Indian artist and researcher Garima Gupta, based in Delhi. And I'm showing you the work here by her that caused me to reach out to her in the first place. Garima's work is about the environmental history of South and Southeast Asia. She makes drawings, observational drawings of natural objects, rocks, plants, animals. And then she layers them with drawings of archival materials that she's found in her own research. And she does this in order to make sense of the visual and ecological legacies of trade and migration histories and European colonial expansion in the region. And so in the work shown here, she uses a leaf of paper from the account books of an oil palm plantation company in Malaysia as the basis for a drawing of 2 oil palm flower heads, male and female. And she creates these layered installations of drawings in light boxes. And so you can kind of see the kind of documentary layer and the observational drawing layer kind of merging together in these light objects. And she does this in order to explore visually a conflict over land use and ecological change in the Malaysian archipelago. So I encountered this work by her, and I approached her about a year and a half ago. This was just before the pandemic went global. And she and I began a conversation about this project that eventually led to a full collaboration between us. And so the 10 specimens that you saw earlier eventually became, over the course of 2020, 10 drawings. And I'm just going to briefly scroll through all 10 of them right now, and then I'll dive deeply into one of them before I finish my talk. So I'm going to finish with the rest of my talk will be telling you the story of this object from the Peabody Museum here, one of the 10 specimens that I honed in on for this project and the first one that I researched. Now, the only documentation in the Peabody archives for this beautiful chunk of rock and crystal is the handwritten label that you can see on it, and that's zoomed in on the right. So the label identifies this mineral as apophyllite with stilbite. And the other information on this label helps us track the object's origins to a place called Por Ghat, a treacherous pass in the northern part of the Western Ghats. The Western Ghats are a mountain range that run up much of the western coast of India. These basalt mountains were formed through violent volcanic eruptions around 66 million years ago. In the mid-19th century, they presented a natural barrier between the British-controlled port city of Bombay and the rich resources of the Indian interior. So it was nearly impossible for any kind of wheeled vehicle to traverse these mountains. And so if the British wanted Indian commodities like silk, opium, cotton, spices, if they wanted these things to flow efficiently overseas for trade, they needed a rail line to cut across the mountains. And so in 1856, the British established the Great India Peninsula Railway Company, and they set out to make it happen. Laying these new rail lines was the largest and most labor-intensive civil engineering project of the British government in India. And it coincided with violent rebellions that saw the British almost lose control of northern India in 1857. The project was carried out over 7 years, 1856 to 1863, and this places it right around the same time as the construction of the Suez Canal. The Poor Ghat works actually employed more workers than the Suez Project, and ultimately it killed many more people. Building this rail line was dangerous work in precipitous terrain. There were severe extremes of weather in the mountains and poor sanitation in the worker camps. Ultimately, over the 7 years of this project, around 25,000 workers died, most of them from cholera, which swept every year through the workers' camps. But vast numbers of laborers, around 42,000 people a year at the height of this project, migrated seasonally across an extensive part of western and southern India to work on the new railway line. They were mostly landless peasants and tribal people who had been relegated to the margins of Indian society, both men and women. British railway overseers recruited and organized workers ethnographically, identifying specific caste communities with specific labor requirements. And so this railway works was also part of a process that transformed fluid regional community identities into hardened stereotypes locked into a hierarchy of skills and status, and a yearly cycle of migration and contract work. So these railway works set a lot of things in motion across the mountains then: capital, commodities, and people. And then on a smaller scale, they also sent minerals in motion as well, because blasting tunnels through the mountains in this place exposed dazzling caves lined with crystals up to 6 feet wide. Even today, these caves are the world's they produce the most spectacular examples in the world of apophyllite, this kind of crystal that only forms in this kind of volcanic rock. Some of the Indian earthworkers who were involved in the railway project took large crystals from these caves, which the caves became known as the jewel tunnels. And they embedded them into the mud walls of their huts in the workers' camps as decoration and as trophy. The chief railway engineer, who was an Englishman named James Barclay, had the largest specimens saved to distribute to natural history museums. Some of them stayed within India, but most were sent to Britain. There, they enabled British scientists and geologists to develop theories for how crystals like these form following volcanic disturbances. And one of these samples ended up in the hands of geologist Neville Story Maskelyne, who was the keeper of minerals at the British Museum in London. His name is actually on the handwritten label there. You can't really see it, but it says donor, N.S. Maskelyne. He eventually gifted it to Yale, where it now resides. So this crystal specimen traveled from deep inside a mountain in Western India to the British Museum in London, and then finally on to New Haven. And it did so on a journey shaped by Indian histories of labor, migration, and transportation, which transformed an entire landscape and shored up British imperial control over the Indian subcontinent. So this was the story that I had begun to delineate for myself around this object, the first one that I researched as part of this project. And I'd assembled this visual archive that I mentioned before of photographs and maps and engravings and charts, just as the pandemic upended our plans for Garima Gupta, the artist. The original plan was for her to come to New Haven, work closely with me, observe the objects, and make art as a result. But amid lockdowns and travel restrictions, we reconceived the project as a remote engagement between us, mediated by high-resolution digital photography, cloud databases, Google Documents, and Zoom. For Garima, whose work typically involves extensive fieldwork and travel across Asia, observing and drawing this specimen of apophyllite involved a real remaking of her practice. she felt her way into each specimen by zooming deep into the digital images that the Peabody Museum provided, finding in each one a kind of micro-landscape of its own. And when her drawing was complete, the main observational drawing of the specimen, she then considered its relation to the real former landscape from which the specimen had been excavated, and to the charts and maps and diagrams that I'd provided for her and which we talked about in extensive conversations. She experimented with placing the drawings against retraced maps of the Borgat railway cuttings. And so ultimately, here is the final work that she created. The whole work is on the left, and then I've kind of zoomed in on the specimen on the right. And it's displayed on a light box, like I was explaining earlier, so that the kind of like multiple layers of the image, and therefore the layers of history in this object, could emerge. And so for each of the objects, we had a kind of back and forth like this. And my text that I wrote for each one and the illustrations that Garima produced were kind of developed collaboratively through that process. And together, my words and her illustrations engage in a kind of exploratory practice of placemaking, bringing into view the transformation of the physical landscape from which the mineral has come, the political and social landscape through which it has traveled, and the surface of the object as a landscape of its own. This is just another example, a close-up of her drawing of the Kimberley mine diamonds. The coming into being of a natural history specimen is a transformative journey in which it sheds a richer sense of place and its movement through culture. And through this collaboration, we've tried to help these objects carry their journeys into the present rather than leaving them behind. Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit more about are there other projects like this that you sort of come across that you'd like to take on, or other ways in which you'd like to see this work evolve? I mean, it's very exciting that the exhibitions will actually come online, and so this project is not entirely complete, as it were.
Yeah. Do you mean other projects here at Yale as part of this, or do you mean,
Related to this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. So I had, while I was at this Yale Center for British Art, I had the opportunity to work with a graduate research assistant on this project, kind of investigating objects and trying to find, I had already kind of conceived the mineralogy project on my own, and I wanted the kind of next stage to emerge more collaboratively with other partners at Yale. The student that I worked with, Manon Godet, we eventually came up with an idea together that was fully kind of co-conceived, such that we're now kind of co-curators, fully equal collaborators on the next stage of this, which we're calling, well, it's a provisional title right now, but we're calling it The Octant's Journey. And so we've honed in on an 18th century navigational instrument that's in the Peabody's Scientific Instruments collection. This is an object that's used to establish latitude at sea. And we are working as part of an exhibition on scientific instruments. It's going to happen at the art gallery, the Yale University Art Gallery, in a couple of years. We're going to be doing a kind of intervention into that exhibition where this navigational instrument basically travels around the exhibition, encountering objects in it and narrating its own history in a printed booklet and on social media. And what we're doing is we're playfully adapting an 18th century literary genre called the it narrative, where objects that are kind of circulating around the world are imbued with narrative power and tell their own stories. And so we're imagining the octant, this navigational instrument, as a kind of stand-in for the museum visitor. So we're dramatizing the process by which meaning is made in a museum through these encounters between the octant and these objects. And the idea is that as it explores objects at the gallery, it is questioning its own role as a kind of navigational instrument from this period of imperial expansion, thinking about its own role in astronomical expeditions, genocide and enslavement, kind of extractive colonialism, and just trying to kind of understand its own implication in those histories. So that's a kind of, it's a very different sort of a project than this, but like this, the idea is to kind of bring objects that don't seem to have anything to do with each other, and use them to really question the categories that have separated them in museums. Because the Yale museums, do a lot of collaborative work together, but still fundamentally, they have these different kind of conventions of display and ways of giving meaning to objects that illuminate them deeply, but also hide certain aspects of them. And I think one of the great possibilities of interdisciplinary humanistic work at a university like Yale that's had a couple of years of collecting history is that it's not just that the collections are rich and deep as resources for our own work, but they are an invitation to kind of turn the lens on the institution themselves and ask really important questions about, well, why is this object here? Why has it been identified as this kind of object rather than another kind of object? And what other sorts of histories might it tell? Yeah.
Has there been any, like, with the museums, permanently change how they exhibit them at all? Like, show that social context? Is that like a recommendation of the study? Or?
Yeah, I mean, that's the hope. That's the hope, right, is to kind of by collaborating with the different museums, start to inspire changes and kind of experiments in how they do things. I think, I mean, maybe another way of describing what I'm after in this project is that I think and now I'm not talking about Yale, I'm talking about kind of European and American museums more broadly. The place where this kind of creative and playful and kind of unexpected work happens is through artist interventions, right? Like people invite the artist to come in, engage with the collection, and then either make work or select work in a way that kind of cuts across the categories that have structured that collection. And I really believe in that work and I find it really powerful. But my worry about it is that it segregates that kind of critical work and says that this is the work of the artist. The institution kind of follows its own kind of dynamic that's not a part of that. And so you end up displaying these kinds of interventions rather than incorporating them into the practice of the museum. So I'm really interested in finding, as a curator, I was trying to do that from within. I'm now working from without again, but also very much with museums. And so my hope is that we start to really, change the way these objects' meaning is displayed in all these different spaces.
Thank you.
Thanks.